Alright, so this is the next artist that we're going to be looking at, Joseph Wright of Derby. This is one of his first sort of candlelight masterpieces that he was known for creating. It's entitled Three Persons Viewing the Gladiator by Candlelight. And it was painted in 1765 and shows three men studying a small copy of this gladiator, this very famous gladiator statue. So Joseph Wright is an artist that was sort of reacting against the Rococo movement. This is the painting that you are responsible for. This is Joseph Wright, and this is entitled A Philosopher Giving a Lecture at the Orrery. And this painting caused quite a great stir. One of the reasons why was that it replaced the classical subject at the center of the scene, the sort of classical gladiator statue that these men are looking at, with one that was scientific in nature. So here, we're seeing this return to scientific observation, and this is what the Age of Enlightenment is about. And this is neoclassical. This neoclassical movement is a style that was born out of this Age of Enlightenment. Wright's depiction of the awe produced by the scientific miracles mark a break with previous traditions in which the artist's depiction of such wonder was reserved for religious events. So again, we're seeing science sort of taking, replacing the subject matter that was usually reserved for religion and sort of mythological events. Since to Wright, the marvels of the technology age were awe-inspiring as the subjects of great religious paintings. So to him, like the observation of his own world and these really sort of interesting, awe-inspiring sort of phenomenon that scientists were discovering was really up there with this idea of religious subject matter. So when we look at the painting, we see two young boys gazing over the edge of a contraption in this sort of in sort of this wonder and amazement. A teenage girl, her arms raised, are resting on the machine, and she's sort of, contemplating what's happening. A young man is shielding his eyes from the brilliance of the light emanating from the center, and a young woman staring unblinkingly at what's happening. You can see her right here. A standing man taking copious notes on the proceedings. So here this figure is. Another man leaning back in his seat, listening intently to this lecturer, this gray-haired lecturer, who is sort of captivating his audience, almost like a magician. So the key idea here is the Age of Enlightenment, that empirical observation grounded in science and reason could best advance society, is expressed by the faces of the individuals in Joseph Wright's painting. And so this is one of the themes that he was expressing. This is another one of Joseph Wright's paintings, An Experiment on a Bird in an Air Pump. This is actually one of my favorite ones. But the one before it is the one that you're actually responsible for. So many of Wright's paintings sort of encapsulate this one moment, the Enlightenment, of the Enlightenment, and really shows this sort of philosophical shift in the 18th century away from traditional religious models of the universe and toward an empirical sort of scientific approach. So both of these paintings really embrace that theme. It's important to note that the term given to this new way of thinking, enlightenment, indicates an active process undertaken by an individual or a group, an individual by a group. Just to give you a little bit of background information, Wright was probably one of the most prominent English painters of the 18th century to spend the majority of his career outside of London. operating within the constraints of mainstream London art world, Wright not having to operate in the constraints of the mainstream London art world, he was free to explore a general interest in science with his friends, a group that included Darwin, or not Darwin, sorry, Esramus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, and other members of the Lunar Society of Birmingham, an informal learned society which met to discuss scientific topics of the day. So when we look at this subject, it really is quite a shift. Now, again, we're sort of jumping back to English, but it definitely is sort of a jump and a shift sort of away from that sort of silly, sort of Rococo subject matter that we saw in France. Wright was known for his perception, or his deft depiction of the contrast between light and dark. So hopefully this painting maybe reminds you of another artist that we looked at a few segments ago, who did something similar with this sort of one light source. Hopefully you can remember his name. I will give you the answer later. So again, this sort of harsh contrast between light and dark, known as chiaroscuro, or really, in this case, tenebrism. And this light really does sort of show these sort of true, when you look close, let me see if I can zoom in. They're not the most this sort of lighting is not the most flattering lighting. And so it's not really, these are very individual portraits of people, but they're not necessarily idealized at all. And so his attempts to work as a portrait artist, didn't really work out so much because people didn't want to be portrayed so unflatteringly. So getting back to a philosopher giving a lecture, this is the one that you are responsible for and is on the list of the 250 required works. In the 1760s, Wright began to explore the traditional boundaries of various genres of painting. According to the French Academies of Art, the highest genre, which we talked about earlier, the highest genre of painting was history painting, remember? Which depicted biblical or classical subjects to demonstrate a moral lesson. Wright took this noble method of sort of portraying events and applied it to a composition showing a contemporary subject. So he's sort of taking this tradition of history painting and applying it to something contemporary and scientific. Rather than a moral of leadership or heroism, this painting's moral is the pursuit of scientific knowledge, with its collection of non-idealized men, women, boys, and girls informally arranged in a small physical space around a central organizing point. So remember my earlier question when I asked you whose work this reminded you of? So this is Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew, when we were looking at Italian Baroque art. And so, in effect, Wright's painting in some ways mimics Caravaggio's depiction of St. Matthew. And the way he's presented his subject, let me go back to it. I mean, he is depicting a moment of religious epiphany in a very similar way that Caravaggio does. Much like the central figure in Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew. Kind of go back. The figures listen to the philosopher's lecture in Wright's painting, and they're sort of experiencing almost a conversion, not to religion, but to science. In case you're wondering what the object in the center of the painting is, it's an orrery. I'm probably saying it wrong. O-R-R-E-R-Y. It's a mechanical model of the solar system, a miniature clockwork planetarium. Each planet, with its moons, is a sphere attached to a swing arm, which allows it to rotate around the sun, when cranked by hand. When in motion, the device depicts the orbits of each planet as well as their relative relationship to each other. The orrery, depicted by Wright, has large metal rings, which can simulate eclipses and give the model a striking and exciting sort of three-dimensionality to it. And so it's like this idea that science is sort of replacing this religious event or this sort of mythological event, and is just as awe-inspiring as those would be. So the events depicted, although exciting, do not give a philosopher lecturing at the orrery its dramatic impact. That responsibility falls on the painting's strong internal light source. So again, sort of referencing Caravaggio, the lamp that takes the role of the sun. Wright's mimics Baroque artists like Caravaggio, who inserted strong light sources and otherwise dark compositions to create this very dramatic effect. Most of these earlier works were Christian subjects, as we saw with the Calling of St. Matthew, and the light sources were often simple candles. Wright flips the script with his scientific subject matter. The gas lamp, which acts as the sun, pulls double duty in the painting. It illuminates the scene, allowing the viewer to see clearly the figures within, and it also symbolizes the active enlightenment in which these figures are participating. So I have no doubt that probably on the major AP exam, you might be confronted with maybe comparing and contrasting these two works of art. Our next artist is a female artist named Elizabeth Vigée LeBron. In the 1700s in France, she painted portraits of nobility, and really thanks to the support of Marie Antoinette, who, this is one of the portraits she did of her, her career really flourished. Vigée LeBron painted more than 30 portraits of the Queen and her family, but was ultimately forced to flee the country during the French Revolution. So we're going to talk about this portrait a little bit, because I know that you guys are familiar with Marie Antoinette. There's a quote that's often misattributed to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, during the famine suffered by her subjects. If they have no bread, then let them eat cake. In fact, this statement, which showed flagrant disregard for the suffering of the people, was never uttered by the Queen, that we know from so many sumptuous portraits. These portraits are largely the work of Elizabeth Louise Vigée LeBron, who really tried to sort of rebrand the Queen and her reputation. In addition to painting Marie Antoinette, she painted other beautiful portraits of European monarchs and nobles. She also did many self-portraits, which we will look at. So, in 1786, Marie Antoinette and her children posed for a portrait by LeBron. And at first glance, we look at the picture, and the resulting picture presents a happy image, it seems like. She is sort of She is gazing loving. Her daughter, right here, gazes sort of lovingly up at her mother. One of her sons, the infant Duke de Normandy, sort of bounces on her lap, and the Dauphin looks every inch sort of like the angelic heir to France. So he's the oldest son, and he will eventually become the King of France. And this is sort of an image that Marie Antoinette always longed for, a vision of the Queen as she wished herself to be seen. And so that's why I'm sort of showing you this image. But if you really look closely, it's really not quite the picture that you think it is when you first look at it. So hopefully when you look closely, and that's something that we all need to really do, we have a tendency to sort of look quickly and not get the whole picture. When you see the Dauphin, you see that he's pointing to the bassinet, And you see that there's not a baby in it. And so he's sort of pointing proudly and invitingly, but when your eyes go to where he's pointing, there's a gaping hole at the center of the picture. When the portrait was first painted, the crib was occupied by another baby, Marie Antoinette's most recent child, Madame Sophie, and then less than a year later, she died. And thoughts of her death really wreaked havoc on Marie Antoinette's mental state, and so it caused her so much pain that Sophie was eventually painted out of the picture. This is another picture of Marie Antoinette that Vigée Lebrun painted. Again, it's a little bit different than this, I think, portrait, which I think does humanize her a little bit more. Here, this is sort of the typical sort of vision we have of Marie Antoinette, dressed very lavishly with these elaborate sort of hairstyle. And even the way she is sort of gazing and sort of, she's in a sort of three-quarter view and sort of showing herself off, but sort of looking past us, the viewer. And why shouldn't she? She shouldn't be looking at us. She's the queen. We should be looking at her. But definitely, I think it's remarkable, these two portraits. And I think you can see, too, when you look closely, what a wonderful painter she was. I mean, the detail, the tonal range, the color, she was quite gifted, Vigée Lebrun. So this is a self-portrait that Vigée Lebrun did. She became as famous and as wealthy as Queen Marie Antoinette's official court painter. This is a self-portrait she did in 1790. And this was created soon after her swift departure from France on the onset of the French Revolution. She painted this in the Galleria Uffizi in Florence, and it really is one of her best-known pictures. It's a late example of the Rococo style. Rococo epitomized a fashionable ideal where it sort of perpetuated youth, with this idea of freedom and this idea of pleasure-seeking, this idea of sexual gratification without guilt or consequences, as we sort of saw when we looked at some of the earlier French Rococo paintings of Fragonard. Despite this, the artist, like her royal patrons, was very extremely conservative in her politics. After fleeing France during the French Revolution in Florence, she was asked to contribute a self-portrait to the Uffizi Gallery, and the Grand Ducal Gallery, which was named after the Grand Duke at the time, who was Marie Antoinette's brother. And this work was actually painted in Rome in 1790. And she really not only emphasizes her role as a professional artist, as you can see, where she's sitting at her easel with her brushes and palette in hand, but she also underscores her formally important position as painter. Oops, I'm sorry, I need to plug that in. To the Queen, by showing an unfinished likeness of Marie Antoinette on her easel, as you can see here. So we'll talk about the composition of the painting. The artist sits in a relaxed pose at her easel, and is positioned sort of slightly off center. She wears a white turban, and a dark dress, in the sort of free-flowing style that Marie Antoinette had made popular at the French court, with a soft white ruffle collar of the same material as her headdress right here. And we'll look at a detail. And again, I just think she was a remarkable painter. I mean, just the detail she was able to capture. And even like this sort of likeness of Marie Antoinette and the softness of it. We'll look at some more details. Her belt is a wide red ribbon. She holds a brush to a partially finished work. Again, the subject is probably Marie Antoinette. and perhaps intended it as a tribute to her favorite sitter. Slightly used brushes are ready along with her palette, and she has sort of everything cradled in her arm, sort of close to the viewer. So I think when we look at this, the painting, isn't just a portrait, but it really does sort of express this alert intelligence that she probably had, and this idea of vibrancy and freedom that she probably experienced when she, was in Florence. Let me get back to the main one. As she painted this portrait, her queen was being driven from power by revolutionaries who really hated the sort of lavish lifestyle of the nobility, and would later execute both Marie Antoinette and her husband, King Louis XVI. Given these circumstances, Vigie LeBron, a working painter, wife, and mother, really does display this sort of extraordinarily sort of persona about herself, I think, and this sort of awareness of what was happening. And so what that means basically is that she's really displaying this extraordinary sort of optimism about herself, and hope, even though this French Revolution was happening in her country. During her 40-year period, from 1778 to 1818, Vigie LeBrun painted about 40 self-portraits. 17 were originals, and then she also made some copies, about 20 of those. Alright, so again, we're going to kind of shift styles a little bit. So in 1785, visitors to the Paris salons were transfixed by one painting done by Jacques-Louis David. It was referred to as the Oath of Horatio, and you probably have seen it. Like Fragonard's The Swing, it really is a magnificent painting that has been sort of appropriated and referenced by other artists. It depicts three men, brothers, saluting toward three swords held up by their father as the woman behind them grieve. No one has ever seen a painting like this. At least during, the contemporaries during this time had never seen a painting like this. Similar subjects had always been seen in the salon before, but the physicality and sort of intense emotion of this painting was very new and undeniable. So in case you don't know the story of the Oath of Horatio, it comes from a Roman legend first recounted by the Roman historian Livy, involving a conflict between the Romans and a rival group from nearby Alba. Rather than continue a full-scale war, they elected representative combatants to settle their dispute. The Romans selected the Horatio, and the Albans chose another trio of brothers, the Curatii, Curatii. In the painting, we witness the Horatio taking an oath to defend Rome. And here it is. Here's a sort of a scale, so you can see how sort of grand the painting was. Looking at it, like how viewers would have looked at it. It is quite a large canvas. So here's the whole composition, and then let's pay attention to the women over to the right. The women know that they will also bear the consequences of the battle because the two families are united by marriage. So it's almost like a soap opera. One of the wives in the painting is a daughter of the Curatii, and the other, Camilla, is engaged to one of the Curatii brothers. Maybe it's Curito. Anyway, at the end of the legend, the sole surviving, it must be Horatio brothers, kills Camilla, who condemned his murder of her beloved, accusing Camilla of putting her sentiment above her duty to Rome. The moment David chooses to represent was, in his reported words, the moment which must have preceded the battle, when the elder Horatio's gathering his son in the family home, make them swear to conquer or die. All right, let's look at some details. We'll kind of focus over here with the men. To tell the story of the oath, David created a very rigorously organized painting with the scene set in what might be a Roman atrium. Remember, that's sort of the center of the city. And it's dominated by 3 arches at the back that keep our attention focused on the main action in the foreground. There we see a group of 3 young men framed by the first arch. So you can really see that it's very thought out in terms of composition and the placement of the subject matters. So here are the 3 Horatio brothers, and they're bound together. Again, very classical. That's why it's called neoclassical, because they are referencing these sort of classical subject matter. Also, I think this is very reminiscent of sort of Greek, Roman classical sculpture that we studied earlier. So they have these very muscled arms raised in this rigid salute toward their father, who is framed by the second arch. And here is a detail where you can get a better, closer look. He holds 3 swords aloft in his left hand and raises his right hand, signifying a promise of sacrifice. The male figures create tense geometric forms that contrast with the soft curves of the women. So you can definitely see how very rigid and upright and lots of sort of linear lines, where when we look at the women, they're sort of slumped and very curved, and even their drapery is a bit softer and more lyrical. So definitely, playing around with these compositional devices. David lit the figures with a sort of stark clinical light that contrasts sharply with the heightened drama of the scene, as if he were requiring the viewer to respond to the scene with a mixture of passion and rationality. So again, very different than the Rococo that we looked at earlier, the French Rococo. Obviously, this is dealing to, it has some other interpretations that deal with this Age of Enlightenment that we'll discuss. So as I talked about before, this is an example of neoclassical art, probably one of the best examples, and usually in beginning art history courses, it's really, this painting in particular is really presented as a prime example of neoclassical history painting. It tells a story derived from the classical world that provides an example of virtuous behavior. The dramatic, rhetorical gesture of the male figures easily convey the idea of oath-taking, and the clear, even light makes every aspect of the story legible. Instead of creating an illusionistic extension of space into a deep background, David radically cuts off the space with the arches and pushes the action to the foreground in the manner almost like a Roman relief sculpture. And so all of these sort of conventions that David has utilized make this neoclassical. So before the Oath of Horatio was created, French history painting was done in a more Rococo style, such as this one in the top left-hand corner. It's in my notes, the artist, Jean-Francois Pierre Perron, and this is called The Death of Ecclestes, 1785. And it involved the viewer by appealing to sort of this idea of sentiment and presenting sort of softly modeled, graceful figures. And I think you can definitely see, here he's sort of using that Rococo, David is using that Rococo style here in portraying the women, but definitely throughout this composition, it's all like sort of very curved and lyrical, where, David sort of was innovative in the way he sort of created this very rigid, rectilinear stance of the male figures. So David does acknowledge the old approach and the figures of the women, but again, he's sort of challenging the convention with these very stark athletic figures in the foreground with these very rigid poses of the men. Before composing the Oath of Horatio, David went to see Poussin, who I talked about earlier. Remember, I talked about the Poussinistas and the Rubenistas, these two sort of divisions or following of these artists, Poussin and Ruben, and they had different painting styles. So David went to see Poussin's Rape of the Sabine Women and employed this sort of, really, I think, employed the style that Poussin, this sort of crisp, linear style, the diagonal style that we talked about when we were talking about high Renaissance painting, where you outline and sort of fill in with color and sort of crisp lines and colors, and didn't really focus on the colorito technique that Rubens embraced. And so even though David is sort of embracing Poussin and using Poussin as his model, he also knew that he was creating a new type of painting, and he wrote, "I do not know whether I shall ever paint another like it," as he developed the austere composition and the powerful physiques. So here, I think when you compare, you can sort of see the influence of Poussin, but also, I think he's really sort of edited the style a little bit more and made it a little bit more restrained and more reserved and sort of a little starker and cleaner, I think, in David's interpretation. Not his interpretation, but, in terms of interpreting his style, not this painting. So today, the painting is typically interpreted in the context of the French Revolution and David's own direct involvement as a revolutionary. So he was one of the revolutionaries who was displeased with the monarchy and their lavish spending and lifestyle. The exact source of the scene that inspired David is in doubt, but it's important to art historians because it can offer clues as to David's intentions for the picture. So remember that cornflake method I talked to you about in terms of interpreting art. Hopefully you watch those art basic videos about contextual analysis and things like that. So when you're looking at a painting or a sculpture, try to think about its function or the artist's intention. In the 19th century, a former student of David identified the source as a 1640 play, Les Horaces by Corneille, that David had seen in Paris in 1782. The difficulty is that no scene of the oath occurs in Corneille's script. However, toward the end of the play, a minor character comes on stage bearing the three swords of the defeated Caravaggio. This stage direction, as well as other contemporary productions and images related to the story of Horatio in particular, and oath-taking in general, may provide the background for David's decision to paint the moment when the brothers take their oath to defend Rome. And really, you can sort of symbolize this in David's sort of own personal interpretation as an act of personal sacrifice for a political ideal, which is what David and many of these revolutionaries during the French Revolution were doing. So with this in mind, we can really understand how a contemporary of David during his time would have read the Oath of Horatio as a painting sort of designed to rally these Republicans, those who believed in the ideas of a republic and not a monarchy for France, by telling them that their cause will require the dedication and sacrifice, the same sacrifice that the Horatio brothers pled to their father. So this is the end of our segment on 18th century art. We will be looking in another segment. We're going to kind of backtrack a little bit and look at early colonial America. We'll be looking at some 18th and 19th century architecture as well. As usual, please be watching the Khan Academy videos that I do include in each of your resource folders related to each subunit. So I hope you enjoyed this. Take care.